Miss Marple and the Haunted Christmas Staircase. Hello dear listeners, pages. I'm Edward, your host, and it warms my heart to know you're here with us tonight. Tell me, what is it that draws you to these cozy mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our daily stories. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Staircase No One Used. The train from London had been 40 minutes late, and by the time Miss Marple's taxi turned through the gates of Greyfriar House, the December afternoon had already surrendered to an early dusk. She sat forward slightly, peering through the window as the house came into view, a square Georgian structure of grey stone that seemed to brood beneath the weight of its own history. "Been here before, miss?" the taxi driver asked, glancing at her in the mirror. "No," said Miss Marple, "though I understand it has been in the Crane family for several generations." "Aye, that it has. Grand old place. Not what it was, mind you. Nothing is these days." Miss Marple made no reply, but her bright, bird-like eyes took in the details as they approached. The grounds were well kept, though not lavishly so. The gravel drive showed signs of recent raking, but wanted proper weeding at the edges. The house itself maintained an air of faded gentility, its windows glowing with lamplight that suggested warmth without quite promising it. The taxi drew to a halt before the entrance, and almost immediately the front door opened. A tall, thin woman of perhaps 50 descended the steps with brisk efficiency. She wore a dark green dress that had been expensive when purchased, but now showed its age in the particular way good cloth does when it has been carefully maintained beyond its natural term. "Miss Marple, how lovely that you could come." The woman's smile was pleasant, her voice carrying the particular brightness of one who has learned to manage social occasions through sheer determination. "I am Elspeth Crane. We have corresponded, of course, but how delightful to meet you at last." "Mrs. Crane," said Miss Marple, accepting the offered hand, "how kind of you to invite me." "Not at all. Any friend of the Bantry family is most welcome here. Now do come in out of the cold. Jenkins will see to your luggage." A man of indeterminate age, wearing the slightly shabby livery of a household that maintained forms without quite maintaining staff, appeared to collect Miss Marple's modest case. His face held the carefully neutral expression of a servant who has witnessed much, but learned to observe little. The entrance hall of Greyfriar House was unexpectedly impressive. The floor was black and white marble, and directly ahead rose the staircase that would, Miss Marple would later reflect, become the centre of so much that followed. It swept upward in a graceful curve, its dark oak banister gleaming faintly in the lamplight. But for all its grandeur, there was something forbidding about it. The stairs were steep, the space above shadowed, and the entire structure seemed to loom rather than welcome. "We've decorated for Christmas," Mrs. Crane said, following Miss Marple's gaze, "perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. My nephew insists on treating the house as though we're expecting royalty, rather than a few old friends for the holiday." Indeed, the staircase was festooned with garlands of holly and ivy, interwoven with red ribbon that cascaded down the banister. Candles had been placed at intervals along the ascent, unlit at present, but clearly intended to create an impressive effect when darkness fell. "It looks very festive," Miss Marple murmured, "though I imagine keeping it all fresh must be quite a task." "Oh, we shan't bother with that," Mrs. Crane said with a brief laugh. "It's only for a week or so. By 12th night it will all come down again. Now, let me show you to your room. I'm afraid we're not using the main staircase. It's rather steep, you see, and the lighting is poor. We use the servants' stairs these days, much more practical." She gestured toward a narrow door to the left of the hall. Miss Marple followed, noting as she did so that the marble floor showed signs of regular use everywhere except directly in front of the grand staircase. There, the pattern of wear and marks suggested a space avoided, rather than merely unfrequented. The servants' staircase was indeed more practical, if considerably less impressive. As they climbed, Mrs. Crane kept up a steady stream of information about the house, the other guests, and the planned festivities. Miss Marple listened with apparent attention, making small, encouraging noises while her sharp mind filed away details. "We're quite a small party this year," Mrs. Crane was saying. "My nephew Charles, of course, he lives here with me since his father's death. Then there's Mr. Harold Ventnor, an old business associate of my late husband. Rather tedious, I'm afraid, but one must be civil. My cousin Pamela Ashford and her daughter Judith are arriving tomorrow, and the Reverend Stokes from the village has accepted our invitation for a Christmas Eve dinner." "How pleasant," said Miss Marple. "A family gathering." Something flickered across Mrs. Crane's face, too quickly to be properly read. Yes, quite. The bedroom to which Miss Marple was shown was comfortable rather than luxurious, with a view over the garden that was no doubt charming in summer, but now showed only bare trees against a darkening skis. A fire had been lit in the grate, and someone had placed a small vase of winter jasmine on the dressing table. "I'll leave you to freshen up," Mrs. Crane said. "We dine at 8. Rather informal, I'm afraid. Just family tonight." When she had gone, Miss Marple removed her hat and coat and sat for a moment by the window. In St. Mary Mead, she reflected, one learned a great deal from observing what people chose to use and what they chose to avoid. Mrs. Emmett, for instance, had ceased using her front parlour after her husband's death, though she would never admit the room held difficult memories. And here was a house with a magnificent staircase that no one used, festooned with decorations as though to convince visitors of its importance while quietly directing them elsewhere. She rose and went to the washstand, noting as she did so that the water in the pitcher was only tepid. A house economizing on hot water suggested a house economizing on other things as well. At dinner, Miss Marple met the other residents of Greyfriar House. The dining room was on the ground floor, reached by a corridor that carefully avoided the main hall. It was a handsome room, though the silver on the sideboard showed gaps where pieces had presumably been sold. Charles Crane proved to be a young man of perhaps 30, good-looking in a rather weak-featured way, with the restless energy of someone who found country life insufferably dull. He greeted Miss Marple with mechanical politeness and he immediately returned his attention to his wine-glass. "Charles handles the estate," Mrs. Crane said, without the particular emphasis that suggested this was a point of some contention, or what remains of it. "What Mother means," Charles said without looking up, "is that I spend my time trying to make ends meet while the house falls down around our ears." "The house is perfectly sound," Mrs. Crane said sharply. "Is it? The roof in the east wing is letting in water. The main staircase is positively dangerous in its current condition, and don't start on the condition of the tenant cottages." Miss Marple observed the exchange with interest. In her experience, families that argued about property were often arguing about rather more than bricks and mortar. The third person at table was Mr. Harold Ventnor, a portly gentleman of 60-odd years with the prosperous look of a man who had done well in business and intended everyone to know it. He had small, shrewd eyes that moved constantly, assessing and calculating. "Your first visit to Greyfriar House, Miss Marple?" he asked, helping himself liberally to the roast. "Yes, indeed. It's a most impressive residence." "Oh, it's impressive enough," Ventnor said. "Question is whether it's sustainable. These old places cost a fortune to maintain. Not that it's any of my business, of course." "Mr. Ventnor has very decided opinions on financial matters," Mrs. Crane said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "He was kind enough to advise my late husband on several investments. And I've been kind enough to review the estate accounts at Elspeth's request," Ventnor added. "Not that my advice is always taken." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Charles Crane refilled his wineglass. Mrs. Crane's fingers tightened on her fork. Miss Marple, observing, was reminded of the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead, when Mr. Price had examined the church accounts and found certain irregularities, the same tension, the same careful avoidance of direct statement. After dinner they moved to the drawing-room for coffee. It was a pleasant room, warmed by a substantial fire, though Miss Marple noted that the curtains had been darned and the upholstery on one of the chairs showed threadbare patches. "I trust you'll be comfortable here," Mrs. Crane said, pouring coffee with hands that were not quite steady. "We lead a very quiet life, I'm afraid. Nothing like London society. I'm sure I shall be very comfortable indeed, Miss Marple replied. I confess I am rather curious about the main staircase. It's quite magnificent. Mrs. Crane's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. Oh, we never use it. Far too steep for safety, and the lighting is inadequate. My husband always meant to have it properly modernised, but somehow one never quite gets around to these things. Pity to let such a feature go to waste, Ventnor observed, though I suppose if it's dangerous, better to avoid it. We thought the Christmas decorations might make it seem less forbidding, Charles said. Not that anyone will actually use it, but it looks well from the hall. Miss Marple sipped her coffee thoughtfully. A staircase too dangerous to use, yet decorated as a centrepiece. A household economising carefully, yet maintaining appearances, and underlying it all, the particular tension that came from money worries and conflicting interests. Later, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple found her thoughts returning to the staircase. She had glimpsed it again as Jenkins showed her to the servants' stairs, and in the lamplight the decorations created strange shadows that seemed to move and shift. The garlands hung heavy with greenery, and somewhere a draught set the ribbons fluttering. It was very quiet in the old house. Miss Marple lay in bed, listening small sounds of settling wood and distant pipes. And then, quite distinctly, she heard footsteps. They came from somewhere below, a measured tread ascending slowly. She listened carefully, trying to place the direction. Not the servants' stairs outside her door, somewhere more distant, more echoing, the main staircase perhaps, but Mrs. Crane had said no one used it. Miss Marple lay still in the darkness, listening as the footsteps climbed higher, then stopped. After a moment, she heard them descending again, fading into silence. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the things people claimed never to do were often the very things that bore closest examination. Chapter 2. Footfalls Without a Body. Miss Marple had long ago learned that the hours between midnight and dawn revealed truths that daylight carefully concealed. In St. Mary Mead, she had observed how Mrs. Carmichael took her sleeping draught at precisely 11 each evening, how Colonel Bantry paced his study when troubled by gout, how the butcher's boy made his illicit visits to the scullery maid at 1:30. A house at night, she reflected, was like a stage with the curtains drawn back, where people moved according to their true natures rather than their public performances. She had not mentioned the footsteps to anyone at breakfast. The meal had been a subdued affair, with Charles Crane appearing hollow-eyed and irritable, Mrs. Crane maintaining a determined cheerfulness that seemed to exhaust her, and Mr. Ventnor consuming an impressive quantity of bacon while reading through a sheaf of papers he had brought to the table. "Sleep well, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Crane had inquired, pouring tea with hands that were steadier this morning. "Very well indeed, thank you," Miss Marple had replied, "though I confess the house does speak at night, doesn't it? All these old places do, settling beams and such. Draughty old barn," Charles muttered. "Costs a fortune to heat and still freezes you half to death." Ventnor had looked up from his papers. "Heard the ghost, did you, Miss Marple?" "Ghost?" Miss Marple's tone was mildly interested. "Oh, the servants have convinced themselves the place is haunted," Mrs. Crane said with forced lightness. "Every creak and groan becomes a supernatural visitation. One must make allowances for imagination, particularly at this time of year." "What sort of haunting do they claim?" Miss Marple asked. Charles gave a short laugh. "Footsteps on the main staircase, apparently. Someone walking up and down when the house is locked up for the night. Complete nonsense, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. But she noted that Mrs. Crane's cup rattled again, very slightly, against its saucer. After breakfast, Miss Marple requested a tour of the house, citing an interest in its architecture. Mrs. Crane seemed reluctant but could hardly refuse, and they set off together through the ground-floor rooms. The house was indeed impressive, though everywhere Miss Marple observed the same careful economy she had noted the previous evening. Good furniture, well-maintained but showing its age. Valuable paintings, though several lighter rectangles on the wallpaper suggested recent sales. Silver that had been present was meticulously polished, but there were gaps where pieces had clearly been removed. "My husband was very proud of Greyfriar House," Mrs. Crane said as they paused in the library. "His family had held it for 3 generations. He would have hated to see it." She stopped herself. "But one must be practical. Charles is quite right about the costs." "It must be difficult," Miss Marple said gently, "balancing sentiment and necessity." "Yes," Mrs. Crane's voice was flat. "Mr. Ventnor has been very helpful in that regard. He has a great deal of financial experience. He seems to take a close interest in the household's affairs." Something flickered in Mrs. Crane's eyes. "Yes, perhaps too close at times, but one must be grateful for assistance, mustn't one?" They had reached the entrance hall, and Miss Marple paused to admire the staircase once more. In the morning light streaming through the high windows, it looked less forbidding than it had the previous evening. The decorations were fresh and attractive, the dark wood gleaming. "May I?" Miss Marple asked, moving toward the first step. "Oh, I wouldn't recommend it," Mrs. Crane said quickly. "The treads are worn quite uneven, and there's a loose section of banister near the top, really quite dangerous." "I see." Miss Marple examined the stairs from where she stood. The treads did indeed show considerable wear, though interestingly not in the centre where one would expect, but along the right side as though someone habitually climbed keeping close to the wall. The banister appeared solid enough from this distance. "We had the servants' stairs reinforced last year," Mrs. Crane continued. "Much more sensible for daily use. This," she gestured at the grand staircase, "this is just for show now." A door opened behind them, and Jenkins appeared. "Begging your pardon, madam, but Mrs. Dorking wishes to speak with you about the linen." "Oh dear." "Please excuse me, Miss Marple. The housekeeper will insist on making decisions I'm perfectly capable of making myself. Do feel free to explore. The morning room is particularly pleasant at this time of day." When she had gone, Miss Marple remained in the hall, studying the staircase with the careful attention she had once given to the curious matter of the jam in Mrs. Price's pantry. That case had taught her that people's explanations for avoiding things were rarely as simple as they claimed. She moved closer, running her hand along the newel post at the base of the stairs. The wood was smooth, well polished. She glanced up at the garlands that draped the banister. They were indeed impressive, heavy with holly and ivy, the red ribbons hanging in elaborate bows at intervals. One garland in particular caught her attention. It hung higher than the others, well above the banister, secured to something she couldn't quite see from this angle. Admiring the decorations, Miss Marple turned to find Mr. Ventnor standing in the doorway to what she believed was the study. He had the particular look of a man who has been waiting for someone to appear. "They're very festive," she replied. "Someone must have taken great care with them. Young Charles is doing, I believe. Thought it might cheer his mother up. Not that anything much cheers Elspeth these days." He came closer, his small eyes fixed on Miss Marple's face. "You're a friend of the Bantry family, I understand?" "A slight acquaintance, only. Mrs. Bantry was kind enough to mention that Mrs. Crane was seeking company for Christmas." "Were you indeed?" Ventnor's tone suggested he found this explanation inadequate. "Well, you've landed yourself in a cheerful household, all the festive spirit of a funeral parlour." "Every family has its difficulties," Miss Marple said mildly. "Difficulties?" Ventnor gave a bark of laughter. "That's one way of putting it. This place is mortgaged to the hilt, the estate barely generates enough income to pay the interest, and Elspeth's been trying to pretend otherwise for the past 3 years. If I hadn't agreed to review the accounts, she'd be in debtor's prison by now. How fortunate that you were able to assist." "Fortunate for whom?" Ventnor's expression was unreadable. "I've spent considerable time going through the books, Miss Marple. Considerable time, and I've found some very interesting discrepancies." Before Miss Marple could respond, footsteps sounded on the servants' front stairs, and a young woman appeared, the housemaid by her dress. She stopped abruptly upon seeing them. "Begging your pardon, sir, miss, I didn't know anyone was here." "Quite all right, Rose," Ventnor said. "We're just admiring the Christmas decorations." The girl's eyes went to the staircase, and Miss Marple observed a distinct flicker of unease cross her face. "Very nice, sir," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Rose doesn't care for the main staircase," Ventnor continued. "Do you, girl? Too many ghosts for your liking." "I'm sure I don't know about ghosts, sir." But Rose's voice trembled slightly. "Come now," Ventnor oppressed, clearly enjoying himself. "You're the one who reported hearing footsteps in the night, walking up and down when everyone was in bed." "I heard something, sir. I couldn't say for certain what it was," Miss Marple intervened gently. "When did you hear these sounds, my dear?" Rose looked at her gratefully. "3 nights running, miss, always after midnight. I sleep in the attic, you see, and the staircase is just below. First I thought it was Master Charles, but when I mentioned it to Jenkins, he said the master had retired early all 3 nights. "Perhaps someone couldn't sleep and was taking a walk," Miss Marple suggested. "That's what Mrs. Dorking said, miss. But who would walk up and down the same stairs over and over, and in the dark too? The lamps aren't lit after 10. "Very sensible not to waste oil," Ventnor observed, "though it does make for a rather gloomy atmosphere." Rose bobbed a curtsy and hurried away, clearly eager to escape. Ventnor watched her go with amusement. "Servants," he said. "Give them half a chance and they'll have the place overrun with headless cavaliers and weeping ladies. Still, I confess I heard something myself last night. Footsteps, just as the girl described. Very distinct." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was politely interested. "Oh yes, I'm a light sleeper, always have been. Comes from years of business travel. Never know when some clerk might be trying to rifle through your papers. I heard footsteps on this staircase shortly after midnight. Slow, measured, as though someone was being very careful." "Did you investigate?" "I looked out my door. I'm in the green room just off the landing upstairs, but I saw nothing. The hall was quite dark. By the time I'd fetched a candle, whoever it was had gone." "How curious!" "Curious indeed." Ventnor's expression became shrewd. "Of course, there are reasons someone might want to move about the house at night without being seen, particularly if they had something to hide." Miss Marple made no reply, but she filed the comment away carefully. In her experience, people who made such observations often had specific suspicions they wished to plant. The morning passed quietly. Charles Crane remained in his room, pleading a headache. Mrs. Crane occupied herself with household matters, appearing periodically to ensure Miss Marple was comfortable before vanishing again. Ventnor shut himself in the study with his papers. Miss Marple spent a pleasant hour in the morning room, ostensibly occupied with her knitting, but in reality observing the household through the window that overlooked the courtyard. She watched Jenkins cross to the stables, his shoulders hunched against the cold. She watched the housemaid Rose hurry to the kitchen garden, glancing nervously at the house as she went. She watched the housekeeper, Mrs. Dorking, a formidable woman in black bombazine, supervise the delivery of provisions with the sharp eye of one who counted every shilling. A household under strain, she reflected. Money troubles, certainly, but there was something more, something that made the servants nervous and the family brittle. That evening after dinner, Miss Marple excused herself early, claiming fatigue from her journey. In truth, she wished to observe the household's nighttime habits. She prepared for bed but remained in her dressing gown, sitting in the chair by her window with her knitting in her lap and her door very slightly ajar. The house settled into silence. At 10 o'clock she heard Mrs. Crane's voice on the servants' stairs, bidding Jenkins good night. At 10:30, Charles Crane's heavier tread passed her door, heading toward his room at the far end of the corridor. At 11, the distinctive sound of Ventnor's door closing with unnecessary firmness. Miss Marple sat very still, her needles moving quietly, her ears attuned to every sound. At midnight she heard them. Footsteps, slow and measured, ascending the main staircase. The particular hollow echo of feet on uncarpeted wood, growing gradually louder. They reached what must be the landing, paused for perhaps 30 seconds, then began to descend again with the same careful rhythm. Miss Marple set down her knitting and moved silently to her door, opening it just enough to peer out. The servants' staircase was dark and empty. The sounds were definitely coming from the direction of the main hall. She stood listening as the footsteps faded, then ceased altogether. Someone was using the staircase that no one used, someone who moved with deliberate care, as though measuring each step, and someone who, for reasons of their own, wished to do so unseen. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that people who claim to avoid places often return to them in secret. The question, always, was why. Chapter 3. The Garland Hung Too High. The following morning brought the arrival of Mrs. Crane's cousin, Pamela Ashford, and her daughter Judith. Miss Marple observed their entrance from the morning-room window, noting the contrast between mother and daughter even at a distance. Mrs. Ashford descended from the motor car with the careful movements of a woman conscious of her dignity, while the younger Miss Ashford bounded out with the energy of youth impatient with formality. "How lovely to see family gathered for Christmas," Mr. Marple remarked to Mrs. Crane, who had joined her at the window. "Yes," Mrs. Crane's tone lacked conviction. "Pamela wrote insisting they simply must come. One can hardly refuse family, can one?" Miss Marple, who had witnessed numerous family gatherings in St. Mary Mead, motivated less by affection than by proximity to wills and property, made a small sound of agreement. The introductions took place in the drawing-room. Mrs. Pamela Ashford proved to be a handsome woman of 45, expensively dressed in a manner that suggested recent prosperity. Her daughter Judith was perhaps 22, with the restless eyes of a girl who found country houses insufferably dull. "Dear Elspeth," Mrs. Ashford said, embracing her cousin with enthusiasm that seemed to make Mrs. Crane uncomfortable. "How brave of you to keep up the house. I said to Judith, didn't I, darling, how brave Cousin Elspeth is, maintaining traditions." "Very brave," Judith agreed, her attention already wandering to the window. "And you must be Miss Marple," Mrs. Ashford continued. "How delightful. We shall be quite a party now, though I confess I was surprised to hear Harold Ventnor was staying. I should have thought, after everything—" "Pamela," Mrs. Crane said sharply. "Oh, but surely Miss Marple knows. Everyone knows about the loans." "I'm sure I know nothing of the sort," Miss Marple said mildly. "I am merely a guest." Mrs. Ashford looked as though she wished to say more, but was prevented by the arrival of tea. The conversation turned to safer topics: the journey from London, the weather, the plans for Christmas Day. Miss Marple listened with apparent attention, while mentally cataloguing relationships and tensions. It was not until after tea, when the party had dispersed to rest before dinner, that Miss Marple found an opportunity to examine the main staircase more closely. She waited until the hall was empty, then approached with the slow deliberation of an elderly lady uncertain of her footing. The garlands were even more elaborate than she had first observed. Someone had woven sprigs of holly and ivy with considerable skill, creating thick ropes of greenery that draped the entire length of the banister. But it was one garland in particular that arrested her attention. It hung approximately halfway up the staircase, secured not to the banister itself but to something above it. Miss Marple ascended carefully, one hand on the banister, until she stood level with the decoration. From here she could see that the garland was tied to a brass hook that protruded from the wall, well above the line of the banister rail. The knot was neat and tight, the work of someone who knew how to secure a rope properly. She reached up experimentally. Even standing on the step, she could barely touch the hook. Someone shorter would need either a stepladder or assistance to reach it. Admiring Charles's handiwork, Miss Marple turned carefully to find Judith Ashford at the foot of the stairs, regarding her with amusement. "It's very impressive," Miss Marple said, "though I was wondering how it was hung so high. Oh, Charles is quite tall, and I think he used the library steps. Mother said he spent half a day decorating this staircase, though goodness knows why. No one ever uses it. So I understand, though I confess I find it rather attractive." Judith came up a few steps, her movements easy and confident. "It's attractive enough in daylight. Less so at night, when the shadows make everything look sinister. The servants claim it's haunted now, you know. They've been hearing things." "Yes, I had heard something of that sort." "Complete nonsense, of course, though I must say, This house does have rather an atmosphere after dark. Judith lowered her voice conspiratorially. I think Cousin Elspeth encourages the talk of ghosts, keeps people from wandering about at night and discovering things they shouldn't. What sort of things? Miss Marple asked mildly. Judith laughed. Oh, I don't know. Family secrets, financial difficulties, that sort of thing. Mother says the house is mortgaged quite desperately. Mr. Ventnor has been going through all the accounts, apparently, looking for discrepancies. Has he found any? I couldn't say, but he and Cousin Elspeth have had some rather tense conversations. I heard them yesterday evening, before you arrived. Raised voices from the study. Very unlike Cousin Elspeth, who's usually so controlled. Miss Marple descended the stairs carefully, Judith following. It must be difficult, she observed, managing a large house on a reduced income. I should think it's impossible. Mother says the only sensible thing would be to sell, but Cousin Elspeth won't hear of it. Family pride, you know. Charles is desperate for her to be practical, but she refuses to consider it. They had reached the hall and Judith paused, looking up at the staircase. I tried to use these stairs last night, actually. I'd forgotten something in the motor car and thought it would be quicker than going round by the servants' entrance. But I heard movement up above, someone on the landing, I think, and it rather put me off. Silly, I know, but the house was so dark and quiet. What time was this? Miss Marple inquired. Oh, quite late. After midnight, certainly. Everyone had retired. Did you see who it was? No. I turned back. Went round the long way after all. Judith smiled. Perhaps I'm more susceptible to atmosphere than I thought. At dinner that evening, the expanded party created a livelier atmosphere, though the underlying tensions remained visible to anyone who cared to observe. Mrs. Ashford dominated the conversation, relating lengthy anecdotes about London society that made Charles Crane increasingly restless and Mr. Ventnor increasingly silent. Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Crane ate very little, and drank her wine rather quickly. When Ventnor made a comment about the excellent claret, Mrs. Crane's hand tightened on her glass. My late husband laid down that wine, she said, before the war. Pity there isn't more of it, Charles muttered. We could sell it and fix the roof. Charles, pleased. Well, it's true, isn't it? We're sitting here pretending everything's fine while the house falls apart around us. I'm sure that's an exaggeration, Mrs. Ashford said smoothly. Greyfriar House has stood for generations. It will stand for generations more. Not without money it won't, Charles retorted. Ventnor cleared his throat. Perhaps this isn't the time or place for such discussions. On the contrary, Charles said, refilling his glass. Perhaps it's exactly the time. We're all family here, aren't we? Except for Miss Marple, of course, no offence intended. None taken, Miss Marple assured him. Then perhaps we should discuss the situation frankly. Mother's been borrowing money to maintain appearances. Mr. Ventnor's been kind enough to review the accounts and has discovered certain irregularities, and we're all pretending we don't know what that means. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Crane's face had gone very white. Ventnor studied his wine-glass with apparent fascination. Mrs. Ashford looked between them with bright, interested eyes. Charles, Mrs. Crane said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, you have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I? Mr. Ventnor, perhaps you'd care to enlighten us. Ventnor set down his glass with deliberate care. I think not. As I said, this is neither the time nor the place. How convenient. Mrs. Crane rose abruptly. Please excuse me. I find I have a headache. She left the room, her back very straight. After a moment, Mrs. Ashford followed, murmuring about seeing if her cousin needed anything. The remaining diners sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Judith spoke. Well, she said brightly, that was awkward. Later, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she reflected on the evening's revelations. A house in financial difficulty, accounts being examined for irregularities. A woman under considerable strain borrowing money to maintain appearances. And underlying it all, the mysterious nocturnal visitor to a staircase that no one supposedly used. She thought of the garland hung too high, requiring either unusual height or mechanical assistance to place. She thought of Judith turning back from the stairs after hearing the movement above. She thought of the careful measured footsteps she'd heard the previous night. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that people returned to places for one of three reasons. They had hidden something there, they wished to retrieve something they had hidden, or they were watching to ensure no one else discovered what they had concealed. The question was which applied here, and the answer, she suspected, would reveal itself soon enough. Chapter 4. A Fall That Wasn't Heard. Miss Marple woke to the sound of screaming. She had been dreaming of St. Mary Mead, of the church fete and Mrs. Price's unfortunate incident with the jumble sale, when the sharp cry shattered the peaceful morning. She sat up quickly, reaching for her dressing gown, her mind already alert despite the early hour. The commotion came from below, a confusion of voices rising through the house. Miss Marple opened her door to find the corridor in disarray. Judith Ashford stood at the top of the servants' stairs in her nightdress, her face white. Mrs. Dorking, the housekeeper, was hurrying past with the particular grim efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked. "It's Mr. Ventnor, miss," Mrs. Dorking said, not pausing. "There's been an accident." Miss Marple followed, moving as quickly as her age permitted. The servants' stairs led down to a passage that connected to the main hall, and it was here that the household had gathered. Mrs. Crane stood near the drawing-room door, one hand pressed to her mouth. Charles Crane was kneeling beside a crumpled figure at the foot of the grand staircase. Mrs. Ashford hovered nearby, for once at a loss for words. Mr. Harold Ventnor lay in an awkward heap on the marble floor, his neck bent at an angle that required no medical knowledge to interpret. His eyes were open and unseeing, his face bearing an expression of surprise rather than fear. "Is he?" Mrs. Ashford began. "Dead," Charles said flatly. He rose, his face pale. "His neck is broken." "We must send for the doctor," Mrs. Crane said, her voice oddly calm. "And the police, I suppose." "Jenkins has already gone for Dr. Matthews," Mrs. Dorking reported. "I sent him the moment Rose found Mr. Ventnor." Miss Marple moved closer, though she was careful not to disturb the scene. Ventnor had fallen at the base of the staircase, his body positioned as though he had tumbled from above and landed heavily. One arm was flung out, the other trapped beneath him. His slippers, worn leather slippers of good quality, remained on his feet. "Who found him?" she asked quietly. "I did, miss," Rose said from the doorway to the servants' passage. The girl was shaking. "I came through to open the curtains, like I always do at 7, and there he was." "What time is it now?" "Just gone 1:15, miss." Miss Marple looked up at the staircase. In the morning light it appeared innocent enough, the decoration still festive, the treads worn but solid. Yet someone had fallen from there during the night, and no one had heard. "Did anyone hear anything unusual?" she asked. "A cry or the sound of a fall?" There was a general shaking of heads. Charles spoke first. "I heard nothing. I sleep rather heavily, particularly after—" He stopped himself. "But I heard nothing at all." "Nor I," said Mrs. Ashford, "though my room is at the back of the house." "I sleep very lightly," Judith offered, "but I heard nothing either. No sound of a fall, no cry, nothing." Mrs. Crane remained silent, her face expressionless. Miss Marple observed her carefully. A woman who had just lost a houseguest to a tragic accident should show some emotion. Shock, distress, even relief if the relationship had been difficult. But Mrs. Crane's face was blank, as though she had retreated somewhere beyond feeling. "Mrs. Crane," Miss Marple said gently, "did you hear anything?" "No." The word was barely audible. "Nothing at all." Dr. Matthews arrived within the half-hour, a brisk country physician with the no-nonsense manner of someone who had seen death in all its varieties. He examined Ventnor briefly, confirmed what was already obvious, and straightened with a sigh. "Broken neck," he said. "Death would have been instantaneous. Poor devil probably slipped on the stairs in the dark." "But why would he be using these stairs?" Mrs. Ashford asked. Everyone knows they're not safe. Perhaps he forgot, the doctor suggested. Or perhaps he thought the servants' stairs were too far. People do foolish things in the middle of the night. His room is just off the landing upstairs, Charles said. The green room. If he came out and turned right instead of left, he'd reach the main staircase before he realised his mistake. Miss Marple considered this. Was Mr. Ventnor in the habit of walking about at night? He mentioned being a light sleeper, Charles replied. Said he often got up to read or look over papers when he couldn't rest. Did he carry a candle with him? There was a pause. Dr. Matthews looked around the floor near the body, then bent to examine Ventnor's dressing gown pockets. No candle, he said. No matches either. If he was walking in the dark, that would certainly explain a fall. But Miss Marple had already observed something that troubled her. The main staircase, for all its supposed danger, showed no signs of immediate hazard. The treads were worn but not broken. The banister appeared solid. And most significantly, Ventnor's slippers showed no scuff marks, no indication that he had tried to catch himself or scrambled for purchase on his way down. In her experience with the unfortunate Mr. Badger in St. Mary Mead, who had fallen from his ladder while attempting to trim the vicarage hedge, the evidence of a fall was always clear. Torn clothing, scraped hands, the marks of desperate grasping. Mr. Ventnor, by contrast, appeared to have simply pitched forward and tumbled downward with no attempt to save himself. The police arrived shortly after 9, in the person of Inspector Cray from the County Constabulary. He was a man of middle age with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many accidents in old houses. He listened to the various accounts, examined the body and the staircase, and made careful notes in a leather-bound book. The doctor believes it was an accident, he said to Mrs. Crane, a tragic mishap. Mr. Ventnor appears to have mistaken his way in the dark and fallen downstairs he didn't realise he was approaching. Yes, Mrs. Crane said. It must have been something of that sort. I'll need to speak with each member of the household separately, Inspector Cray continued. Just routine questions, you understand, to complete my report. The interviews took place in the library. Miss Marple, as a guest, was questioned last. She answered truthfully about her arrival, her observations of the house, her knowledge, limited though it was, of Mr. Ventnor's habits. Did you hear anything unusual last night? Inspector Cray asked. I'm afraid my hearing is not what it once was, Miss Marple said, which was both true and somewhat misleading. I sleep rather soundly. And your impression of Mr. Ventnor? I had very little acquaintance with him. He seemed a man of business, concerned with financial matters. He was reviewing the household accounts, I understand. So I gathered. Inspector Cray made a note. There seems to be some financial difficulty here. Debts, mortgages, that sort of thing. I really couldn't say, Inspector. I'm merely a guest. He nodded, closed his notebook and stood. Well, Miss Marple, I think that will be all. A sad business, but these things happen. Old houses, dark staircases, elderly gentlemen who should know better than to wander about at night. After he'd gone, Miss Marple sat alone in the library for some time, thinking. The inspector's conclusion was certainly reasonable. But there were details that troubled her. Ventnor had mentioned being a light sleeper, cautious from years of business travel. Would such a man venture onto an unfamiliar staircase in complete darkness? No one had heard the fall. In Miss Marple's experience, a body tumbling down a long wooden staircase made considerable noise. Yet an entire household, including 2 people who claimed to be light sleepers, had heard nothing. And then there was the matter of Ventnor's room. Miss Marple had taken note of the house's geography. The green room was indeed just off the upstairs landing, but to reach the main staircase from there, one would have to pass the servants' stairs first. It seemed an unlikely mistake for a man who had been staying in the house for several days. She rose and made her way back to the entrance hall. The body had been removed, but the space at the foot of the staircase remained empty, as though the household was reluctant to pass through it. Miss Marple stood where Ventnor had lain and looked upward. The staircase swept away above her, elegant and dangerous. The garlands hung motionless in the still air. and somewhere up there in the darkness of the previous night, a man had fallen to his death without making a sound that anyone would admit to hearing. Miss Marple thought of the careful, measured footsteps she had heard on 2 separate nights. She thought of the garland hung too high. She thought of Judith turning back after hearing movement on the landing, and she thought of Mrs. Crane's blank face, empty of the emotions one would expect from a hostess whose guest had died in her home. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that the things people didn't hear were often as significant as the things they did. The house settled into subdued quiet. Mrs. Ashford and Judith kept to their rooms. Charles Crane shut himself in the study with a bottle of whisky. Mrs. Crane moved through her duties with mechanical efficiency, making arrangements for the removal of the body, writing to Ventnor's solicitor, managing the household as though nothing had changed. Only the servants spoke in whispers of what everyone was thinking. The staircase that no one used had claimed its victim, and no one, it seemed, had heard him fall. Chapter 5, The Landing After Midnight. The afternoon brought a grey drizzle that suited the mood of the household. Miss Marple sat in the morning room with her knitting, observing the comings and goings through the window, while her needles moved with steady precision. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the period immediately following a death revealed much about the relationships that had existed before it. People relaxed their guards, spoke more freely, and often betrayed feelings they had previously concealed. Mrs. Dorking appeared at 3:30 with tea, her mouth set in a grim line. "Will you be staying on, miss?" she asked as she set down the tray. "Only Mrs. Crane hasn't said, and I need to know for the housekeeping." "I believe I shall remain until after Christmas, unless Mrs. Crane would prefer otherwise," Miss Marple replied. "Seems unkind to desert her at such a time." "Very good of you, I'm sure." Mrs. Dorking paused, then added in a lower voice, "Though between you and me, miss, there's some as thinks it's not safe to stay in a house where such things happen." "You mean Rose?" "Rose and others. They are saying the house is cursed, that the old staircase is dangerous, foolish talk. But there it is." "What do you think happened, Mrs. Dorking?" The housekeeper's eyes met Miss Marple's with surprising directness. "I think, miss, that Mr. Ventnor was a man who asked too many questions, and I think some questions are better left unasked." With that cryptic observation she departed, leaving Miss Marple to ponder her words over her tea. The evening meal was a subdued affair. Only Mrs. Crane, Charles and Miss Marple came to the dining room. Mrs. Ashford had requested a tray in her room, claiming a sick headache, and Judith had elected to keep her mother company. "The undertakers will come tomorrow," Mrs. Crane said, her voice flat. "I've arranged for Mr. Ventnor to be taken to the village church until his family can be contacted." "Did he have family?" Charles asked, pushing food around his plate without eating. "A sister in Bournemouth, I believe. I've written to her." They ate in silence for a time. Then Charles spoke again, his voice rough. "Mother, we need to discuss what happens now. I don't see what there is to discuss." "Don't you? Ventnor was here reviewing the accounts. Whatever he found dies with him, I suppose." Mrs. Crane's fork clattered against her plate. "Charles, please, not now." "When then? He came here because you asked him to help sort out the finances. He spent days going through Father's papers, the bank statements, everything. And now he's dead and we're no closer to understanding." "That's enough." Mrs. Crane's voice was sharp. "We will discuss this another time. Miss Marple is hardly interested in our private affairs." But Miss Marple observed the quick glance that passed between mother and son, laden with meaning she could not quite interpret. Charles looked as though he wished to say more, but thought better of it. He finished his meal in silence and excused himself immediately afterward. Mrs. Crane remained, making mechanical conversation about the weather and the village Christmas preparations. But her hands trembled as she lifted her coffee cup, and her eyes had a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult thoughts. "You must think us very inhospitable," she said at last, "inviting you for a pleasant Christmas and subjecting you to this tragedy instead." "These things cannot be predicted," Miss Marple said gently. "No one could have foreseen such an accident." No. Mrs. Crane's voice was barely audible. No, I suppose not. Mrs. Crane, Miss Marple ventured. Forgive me for asking, but did you hear anything at all last night? Any sound that might have been Mr. Ventnor's fall? Mrs. Crane's cup rattled in its saucer. I told the inspector I heard nothing. Yes, but sometimes in the quiet of reflection we remember small details we initially overlooked. There was a long pause. Mrs. Crane stared at her coffee, as though it held answers to questions she dared not ask. I may have heard something, she said finally. A sound. I'm not certain when. I took my sleeping draught rather earlier than usual. I've been having difficulty resting. When one takes such things, sounds from dreams and reality become confused. What sort of sound? Voices, perhaps. Or a voice. I couldn't say for certain. And later, much later, I thought I heard footsteps. But then I've been hearing footsteps for several nights now, so I may have imagined it. Miss Marple's needles paused. The footsteps on the main staircase? Yes, the servants have been talking about them, as I'm sure you know. Ghosts and hauntings and foolishness. But I have heard them myself 3 nights before last night. All was after midnight. All was the same, slow, measured, ascending and then descending. Did you investigate? No. Mrs. Crane's voice was firm. I am not a fool, Miss Marple. If someone wishes to use the staircase at night, that is their affair. I assumed it was Charles, perhaps unable to sleep and taking the air despite what he told Rose. But you didn't ask him? I did not wish to pry into his nocturnal habits. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, considering this. A woman who heard mysterious footsteps in her home but chose not to investigate suggested either a remarkable incuriosity or deliberate avoidance of unwelcome knowledge. After Mrs. Crane had retired, Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room, ostensibly reading but in reality thinking. The house was very quiet. Somewhere a clock chimed 9, and she heard Jenkins making his rounds, checking locks and banking fires. At 10 o'clock she made her way upstairs to her room, but again she did not prepare for bed. Instead, she sat in her chair by the window, knitting in her lap, and waited. The household settled. She heard the familiar sounds, Mrs. Crane's door closing, Charles's heavier... The servants completing their final tasks. By 11, silence had descended. Miss Marple waited, her ears attuned to every creak and whisper of the old house. At 15:15 midnight she heard the movement. Not footsteps this time, but the soft sound of a door opening somewhere below. She rose quietly and moved to her own door, opening it just enough to peer into the corridor. The servants' staircase was dark and empty, but light showed beneath Charles Crane's door at the far end of the passage. A thin line of yellow that suggested a candle or lamp within. Miss Marple stood very still, listening. The sound came again, a door closing very softly. Then silence. She waited another 5 minutes, but heard nothing more. Whatever movement there had been had ceased. She was about to return to her chair when she noticed something that made her pause. Light. Not from Charles's room, but from somewhere else. A faint glow that seemed to be coming from the direction of the main staircase, visible through the corridor window that overlooked the entrance hall. Miss Marple moved quietly to the window and looked down. The entrance hall was illuminated, not brightly but enough to see clearly. The light came from the upstairs landing, a steady glow that cast long shadows down the staircase. As she watched, something moved in those shadows, or seemed to move. The garland swayed slightly, as though disturbed by a draught or a passing presence. She remained at the window for perhaps 10 minutes watching. The light continued to burn unchanging. No one appeared on the stairs, no footsteps sounded, yet the very fact of the light's presence was significant. Mrs. Dorking had been quite clear about the household routine. The lamps were extinguished at 10 o'clock to save oil. Yet here was the landing light burning well after midnight. Miss Marple thought of what the housekeeper had said that afternoon. The landing light would have been visible to anyone in the entrance hall, casting shadows that would seem to move as the flame flickered. To someone nervous or imaginative, Those moving shadows might appear as figures ascending or descending the stairs. A haunting created not by supernatural means, but by simple manipulation of light and shadow. After a time she returned to her room and sat once more in her chair, thinking. In St. Mary Mead, young Timothy Grant had frightened his sisters by claiming their nursery was haunted, using nothing more than a candle and a sheet to create convincing ghostly apparitions. The effect had been startling until the deception was revealed. Someone at Greyfriar House was creating an illusion of haunting. The question was why? To frighten the servants? Possible, but to what end? To keep people away from the main staircase at night? More likely, but again for what purpose? Or perhaps, and this thought made Miss Marple's needles pause, to establish a pattern of mysterious nocturnal activity that would provide cover for something else entirely. She thought of Ventnor lying dead at the foot of the stairs. A man who asked too many questions, Mrs. Dorking had said. A man who'd been reviewing the household accounts and finding discrepancies, and now that man was dead, having apparently fallen down a staircase in the dark. Yet the landing light had been burning. Mrs. Crane had confirmed that fact to the inspector. She had noticed it in the morning, had remarked to Mrs. Dorking that it should not have been left on overnight. If the light had been burning when Ventnor fell, he would have been able to see the stairs clearly. The shadows might have been confusing, but the steps themselves would have been visible. So why would a cautious man, one who claimed to be always alert, have fallen downstairs he could see? Miss Marple rose and moved to her washstand where she had placed the small notebook she always carried. In it, she began to write down facts, arranging them in careful order. The footsteps had been heard on 3 nights before Ventnor's death, always after midnight, always following the same pattern, ascending, pausing, descending. Judith had turned back from the staircase after hearing the movement above. That was the night before Ventnor died. Ventnor himself had heard the footsteps and investigated, though he claimed to have seen nothing. The landing light had been left burning overnight, something the housekeeper insisted never happened under normal circumstances, and Ventnor had been found at the foot of the stairs, dead from a broken neck, with no one claiming to have heard his fall. Miss Marple tapped her pen against the notebook, considering. In the case of the vicar's missing alms box, the solution had become clear once she stopped accepting what people claimed to be true and instead examined what must logically have occurred. People said they heard footsteps but saw no one, yet footsteps required feet, and feet required a body. People said they heard nothing when Ventnor fell, yet a body falling down a wooden staircase must make considerable noise. People said the landing light was never left burning, yet it had been burning that night. One of these things, or perhaps all of them, was not quite true. Miss Marple closed her notebook and returned to her chair. She would not sleep tonight. Instead, she would watch and listen, as she had done in St. Mary Mead when solving the mystery of the poisoned chocolates. Because somewhere in this house someone knew the truth about what had happened on the staircase. And truth, as Miss Marple had learned long ago, always revealed itself to those patient enough to wait. Chapter 6. The Banister Polished Clean. Morning brought a pale winter sun that did little to warm the atmosphere at Greyfriar House. Miss Marple descended to breakfast via the servants' stairs, as had become her habit, and found only Charles Crane at table. He looked as though he had slept poorly, his eyes shadowed and his hands unsteady as he poured coffee. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, with an attempt at civility. "I'm afraid you'll find us a rather grim household today. Mother has taken to her room, and the Ashfords are still abed." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple replied, accepting the coffee he offered. "These are difficult circumstances for everyone." "Yes." Charles drank his coffee black and strong, like a man seeking fortification rather than refreshment. "I suppose the inquest will be soon?" "Not that there's much to investigate. A tragic accident, as the inspector said." Miss Marple helped herself to toast and marmalade. "Did you know Mr. Ventnor well?" "As well as one knows a friend of one's father, which is to say not well at all. He was useful to father in business matters, and he had been useful to mother, or so she claimed, in sorting out the estate finances." That must have been a comfort to her. Charles gave a short, bitter laugh. I'm not certain comfort is the word I'd choose. Ventnor had a talent for uncovering uncomfortable truths. He'd been here less than a week and had already made it clear that the accounts didn't balance properly. Indeed. Oh yes, debts father hadn't disclosed. Loans taken out using the house as security. Money borrowed from one source to pay another. The whole edifice was rather shakier than Mother wanted to admit. He paused, then added quietly, Ventnor told me as much 2 days ago. Said he needed to speak with Mother about certain discrepancies before he could complete his review. Did he say what sort of discrepancies? No, but I gathered they were significant. Charles set down his cup with a sharp click. And now he's dead, and whatever he found dies with him. Convenient, one might say. Mr. Crane, Miss Marple said gently, surely you're not suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything, Miss Marple. I'm merely observing that Ventnor's death has resolved certain difficulties very neatly. He rose abruptly and left the room, leaving Miss Marple to finish her breakfast alone. After the meal, she requested permission from Mrs. Dorking to examine the main staircase more closely. The housekeeper's eyebrows rose, but she made no objection. You're welcome to look all you like, miss. Though I can't think what you expect to find. The inspector and the doctor both examined it thoroughly. I'm sure they did, Miss Marple agreed, but I find I have a curiosity about old houses and their architecture. Purely personal interest, you understand. Mrs. Dorking sniffed, but led her to the entrance hall. In the morning light, the staircase looked innocent enough. The Christmas decorations remained in place, though they seemed incongruous now. Festive ornaments marking the site of a death. We'll be taking down the garland soon, Mrs. Dorking said, following Miss Marple's gaze. Doesn't seem right to leave them up under the circumstances. No, I suppose not. Miss Marple moved to the base of the stairs and looked up. Tell me, Mrs. Dorking, you're quite certain the landing light was burning when you came down yesterday morning? Positive, miss. I noticed it particularly because I always check the lamps myself before retiring. I know for a fact it wasn't lit when I made my rounds at 10 o'clock. So someone must have lit it during the night. Must have done, miss. Though who and why I couldn't say. Miss Marple began to climb the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister. The wood was smooth beneath her palm, polished by generations of use, despite the family's claim that the staircase was no longer employed. She ascended methodically, pausing on each tread, some to examine the surface. The wear pattern confirmed what she had observed before. The stairs showed the most use along the right side, near the wall, as though someone habitually climbed, keeping close to the edge. The centre of each step was less worn, suggesting they had been avoided. Halfway up, she paused to examine the garland that had caught her attention previously, the one tied to the brass hook high above the banister. From this angle, she could see that the knot was not merely functional, but specific. A sailor's knot, unless she was much mistaken. The sort of knot young Timothy Grant had learned in the Sea Scouts and had proudly demonstrated to anyone who would watch. Did Mr. Charles Crane serve in the Navy? She asked Mrs. Dorking, who had followed her up the stairs. The war, you mean? No, miss, he was too young. Joined up in 18, but the war ended before he saw active service, Territorial Army, I believe. I see. Miss Marple continued upward until she reached the landing. It was a generous space, L-shaped, with the green room visible through a door to the left and the corridor to the family bedrooms extending to the right. A lamp stood on a small table near the window, the landing light that had burned through the night of Ventnor's death. She examined it carefully. It was a simple oil lamp, well maintained, with a clean chimney and full reservoir. Someone had trimmed the wick recently. It showed none of the smoking or unevenness that would indicate neglect. This lamp burns quite steadily? She asked. Oh, yes, miss. We keep all the lamps in good order. Can't afford to be wasteful with oil. Miss Marple turned her attention to the banister. Along most of its length, the wood showed the patina of age, smooth but not excessively so, with the slight dulling that came from accumulated years. But one section, approximately 2 feet in length and positioned where someone standing on the landing might lean, was different. It was polished to a higher sheen, almost glossy, as though it had been gripped repeatedly by the hands that left their oils on the wood. Not the casual touch of someone passing, but the sustained contact of someone who had stood there frequently, leaning over to look down into the hall below. Miss Marple ran her hand along this section thoughtfully. In St. Mary Mead she had observed similar wear on the railing of the church bell tower, where young Peter Carmody had spent hours leaning over to watch the village below, much to his mother's distress. "Mrs. Dorking," she said, "does anyone in the household have a habit of standing here?" The housekeeper frowned. "Not that I've noticed, miss. Though I suppose Master Charles might have done when he was hanging the decorations. He'd need to lean over to position the garlands properly." Yes, that might account for it. But Miss Marple was not convinced. The wear suggested frequent use over an extended period, not the brief contact involved in hanging Christmas decorations a few days ago. She leaned over the banister herself, looking down into the entrance hall. From this vantage point, one could see the entire space clearly: the front door, the passages leading to the drawing room and study, the base of the staircase where Ventnor had been found, and one standing here in darkness, with the landing lamp burning behind them, would be virtually invisible to anyone below. The light would create a silhouette perhaps, but no clear view of the watcher's identity, and the person below, looking up toward the light, would see movement in the shadows as the watcher shifted position, movement that might seem supernatural to someone already nervous about ghostly footsteps. Miss Marple straightened and continued her examination. The door to the green room stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open and looked inside. It was a pleasant chamber, decorated in faded greens and golds, with a comfortable bed and well-appointed furnishings. Ventnor's possessions had been packed by the servants. His case stood ready near the door, his brushes and personal items arranged neatly on the dressing table. The bed was made with military precision, the counterpane smooth and undisturbed. "The bed wasn't slept in, I understand," Miss Marple observed. "No, miss. Just as it was when Rose came to turn it down the evening before. Mr. Ventnor never retired to his room that night." "How odd. Did anyone remark upon it at the time?" "Not until after he was found, miss. We just assumed he'd risen early and made the bed himself. Some gentlemen are particular about such things." Miss Marple moved to the window, which overlooked the front drive. From here one would have an excellent view of anyone arriving or departing. She turned back to examine the room more carefully. On the writing desk lay several papers, neatly stacked. She glanced at Mrs. Dorking, who nodded permission. The papers were financial documents, bank statements, mortgage agreements, receipts. Ventnor had clearly been methodical in his review of the Crane family finances. One sheet in particular caught her attention. It was covered in Ventnor's writing, a series of calculations and notations. "Discrepancy in quarterly payments," she read aloud. 200 unaccounted for each quarter since Jan 23. Total £1,600. Query household expenses or personal use. Mrs. Dorking's face was impassive. "I couldn't say what Mr. Ventnor meant by that, miss." "No, I suppose not." Miss Marple returned to the landing and stood once more at the polished section of banister. She thought of Ventnor. Discovering financial irregularities. She thought of Mrs. Crane's evident strain, her reluctance to discuss the accounts. She thought of Charles's bitter observation that Ventnor's death had resolved certain difficulties, and she thought of the pattern she had observed, the mysterious footsteps, the burning lamp, the garland hung high, the staircase that no one supposedly used, but which showed clear evidence of regular passage. Someone had been using this landing as a watching post, someone who gripped the banister while leaning over to observe the hall below, someone who had stood here repeatedly, perhaps listening for sounds from the study where private conversations might take place, or watching for movements in the house during the quiet hours. In her experience, people who watched and listened in secret were either protecting something or gathering information for their own purposes. The question was which applied here. She descended the stairs slowly, her hand once more on the banister. At the base she paused and looked back up at the landing. From this angle, With light behind it, the landing would appear as a bright rectangle, with any figure standing there reduced to a dark silhouette. A figure that might seem to float in the air, untethered and ghostly, to someone viewing it from below in a state of nervous anticipation. "Thank you, Mrs. Dorking," she said. "You've been most helpful." "I'm sure I don't know how, miss, but you're welcome, I'm sure." Miss Marple returned to the morning room and her knitting, but her mind was working methodically through the evidence. In St. Mary Mead, the solution to the mystery of the missing church funds had become clear once she stopped accepting the obvious explanation and instead examined who benefited from the confusion. Here, the obvious explanation was an accidental fall in the darkness, but the landing light had been burning, and someone had been using the staircase regularly, despite all claims to the contrary, which suggested that Mr. Ventnor's death was not quite the simple accident it appeared to be. Chapter 7. A Room Left Unvisited. The afternoon brought the Reverend de Stokes from the village, a white-haired gentleman of gentle manner who had come to offer condolences and discuss arrangements for a memorial service. Miss Marple observed his arrival from the morning-room window and noted that Mrs. Crane received him in the drawing-room with rather more composure than she had shown in recent days. Miss Marple was invited to join them for tea, and she accepted with quiet thanks. The Reverend proved to be a thoughtful man who spoke sensitively about loss and the unexpected nature of death. "I understand Mr. Ventnor was here on business matters," he said, accepting a cup from Mrs. Crane. How very true that his visit should end in such tragedy. "Yes," Mrs. Crane replied, her voice steady. "He was reviewing our accounts. My late husband trusted him implicitly in financial matters. A fall on the stairs, I'm told. These old houses can be treacherous. I've often thought the rectory staircase would benefit from better lighting." "The main staircase here has always been difficult," Mrs. Crane agreed. "We should have taken it out of use years ago. If we had, this might never have happened." Miss Marple sipped her tea and listened. Mrs. Crane's manner suggested a woman who had prepared her narrative carefully and was now delivering it with conviction. The guilty conscience, Miss Marple reflected, often expressed itself through excessive explanation. After the Reverend had departed, Miss Marple requested permission to rest in her room before dinner. Instead, she made her way quietly to the green room. The door was unlocked, and she slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The room was exactly as she had left it earlier. Neat, undisturbed, the bed untouched. She moved to the wardrobe and opened it carefully. Ventnor's clothes hung in orderly fashion. 2 suits, evening dress, a dressing gown of dark blue silk. In the drawers below she found shirts, collars, undergarments, all arranged with military precision. On the dressing table his brushes were aligned perfectly. A leather folder contained business correspondence, all neatly filed. Ventnor had been a methodical man, someone who maintained order in his surroundings, yet he had not slept in his bed the night he died. Miss Marple examined the bed more closely. The sheets were fresh, the pillowcase crisp and unwrinkled. She pulled back the counterpane and ran her hand across the bottom sheet. It was smooth, untouched. No one had lain here, not even briefly. She thought of Ventnor's habits as described by others. A light sleeper, he had said. A man who often rose to read or review papers when rest eluded him. Yet his room showed no signs of such activity. No book lay open on the bedside table. No papers were scattered on the writing desk beyond those he had been working on during the day. The implications were clear. Ventnor had never retired to his room that night. He had gone somewhere else, or been summoned somewhere else, before he could prepare for bed. Miss Marple moved to the door and opened it slightly, peering out at the landing. From the green room one would turn left to reach the family bedrooms via the servants' stairs. Turn right, and one would encounter the main staircase almost immediately. If Ventnor had been called from his room, perhaps by a knock at his door or a voice in the corridor, he might have stepped out to investigate. But why would he then proceed to the main staircase rather than following the voice back toward the servants' stairs where the bedrooms lay? Unless, of course, he had been specifically asked to meet someone there. Miss Marple closed the door and returned to the writing desk. Among Ventnor's papers she found a small diary. She hesitated only briefly before opening it. The entries were terse, mainly appointments and financial notations, but the entry for the day before his death gave her pause. EC most agitated when presented with figures, claims she can explain discrepancies but requests time, agreed to discuss privately tomorrow evening after household retires, must be certain before proceeding. EC could only be Elspeth Crane. Miss Marple turned to the next page, the day of Ventnor's death, but it was blank. He had not lived to record what transpired. She replaced the diary carefully and left the room, her mind working through the sequence of events. Ventnor had discovered financial irregularities. He had confronted Mrs. Crane. She had requested a private discussion after the household retired, and that night, Ventnor had died on the staircase he never used. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though not yet a complete picture. At dinner, Mrs. Ashford and Judith rejoined the party, both dressed in subdued colours that acknowledged the death without quite achieving mourning. Charles was absent, having sent word that he was dining in the village with friends. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Ashford said as the soup was served. "I confess I shall be relieved when we can return to London. The atmosphere here has become quite oppressive." "You're leaving?" Miss Crane's voice was sharp. "Well, naturally. We can hardly celebrate Christmas under these circumstances. Judith and I will depart the day after tomorrow. I'm sure you understand, dear Elspeth." "Of course." But Mrs. Crane's hands tightened on her soup spoon. "Mother is always so sensitive to atmosphere," Judith added. "She says the house feels different now, darker somehow." "Houses don't change," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Only our perceptions of them." "Perhaps," Judith said, "but I must admit, I've been rather nervous at night. I keep thinking I hear sounds, footsteps, doors opening. Last night I was quite certain someone was moving about in the corridor outside my room." "What time was this?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh, quite late. After midnight. Certainly, I almost got up to investigate, but then I remembered poor Mr. Ventnor and thought better of it." Mrs. Crane had gone very pale. "You must have been dreaming." "No, I'm quite certain I was awake. I heard footsteps pass my door, very soft, then stop, as though someone was standing just outside, listening." "How very unsettling," Mrs. Ashford said. "You see, Elspeth, the house is affecting all of us. Better that we leave before—" "Before what?" Mrs. Crane's voice was strained. "Before there are any more accidents, of course. What else could I mean?" The meal continued in uncomfortable silence. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Crane closely. The woman was barely eating, her face drawn and her movements mechanical. Whatever burden she carried, it was growing heavier. After dinner, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to her room. She prepared for bed, but once again positioned herself in the chair by the window, knitting in her lap, waiting. The house settled into its nighttime routine. She heard the familiar sounds of doors closing, footsteps fading, lamps being extinguished. At 11 o'clock, silence descended. Miss Marple waited, her needles moving in steady rhythm. At midnight, she heard it. The soft sound of a door opening, followed by her careful footsteps, not on the main staircase this time, but in the corridor outside her room. She rose silently and moved to her door, opening it a crack. A figure moved past in the darkness, carrying a candle. The flickering light briefly illuminated a face before the figure descended the servants' stairs. "Mrs. Crane." Miss Marple waited a moment, then followed at a discreet distance. The servants' stairs led down to the passage that connected to the main hall. She descended carefully, staying in shadow. In the entrance hall, Mrs. Crane stood at the foot of the main staircase, looking upward. The landing light was burning again, casting its glow down the stairs. Mrs. Crane stood very still, her candle held before her, staring up at the landing as though seeing something there that held her transfixed. Then, to Miss Marple's surprise, she began to climb. She ascended slowly, placing each foot with care, one hand on the banister. When she reached the landing, she stopped at the exact spot where the wood showed the polished ware. She set down her candle and gripped the banister with both hands, leaning over to look down into the hall below. Miss Marple watched from the shadows. Mrs. Crane remained there for several minutes, motionless, staring down at the place where Ventnor had been found. Then she straightened, picked up her candle, and descended again with the same careful tread. She paused at the base of the stairs, looking up once more. In the candlelight, her face was haggard. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty air. "I'm so very sorry." Then she returned to the servants' stairs and disappeared from view. Miss Marple remained in shadow until she heard Mrs. Crane's door close above. Then she emerged and stood at the foot of the staircase looking up at the burning landing light. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that people returned to places where significant events had occurred, sometimes from guilt, sometimes from grief, sometimes from a compulsion to relive what could not be changed. Mrs. Crane was returning to the staircase night after night, standing at the place where she had stood before, looking down at the spot where a man had died. The question was whether she was remembering an accident she had witnessed, or a death she had caused. Chapter 8. The Visitor Who Turned Back. Morning found Miss Marple in the library, ostensibly browsing the shelves, but in reality considering what she had witnessed the previous night. Mrs. Crane's nocturnal vigil at the staircase had been revealing in its emotion, yet ambiguous in its meaning. Guilt could spring from many sources, from harm caused, from harm witnessed, or simply from harm that might have been prevented. She had just selected a volume on local history when Judith Ashford appeared in the doorway, dressed for travel in a smart coat and hat. "Oh, Miss Marple, I wondered if I might have a word before we depart. Mother is upstairs supervising the packing, and I find myself wanting to speak freely." "Of course, my dear, do sit down." Judith settled into a chair nearer the window, her expression troubled. "I've been thinking about what I said last evening, about hearing someone in the corridor. I'm afraid I wasn't entirely truthful." "Indeed?" "The fact is, I heard someone on the night Mr. Ventnor died as well, the night before last. I didn't mention it to the inspector because I wasn't so certain it was relevant, but now I think perhaps it was." Miss Marple set down her book and gave the girl her full attention. "What did you hear?" "Voices. 2 people talking very quietly somewhere below. I got up to investigate. It was curiosity more than concern, and when I reached the servants' stairs, I could hear them more clearly. They were in the entrance hall." "Could you distinguish who was speaking?" "Not at first. I went down a few steps and listened. One voice was Mr. Ventnor's. I recognized his particular way of speaking, rather pompous and precise. The other was a woman's voice, but I couldn't determine whose." "What were they discussing?" Judith hesitated. "Money. At least that's what I gathered. Mr. Ventnor said something about accounts not balancing, about funds that should have been there but weren't. The woman's voice was upset, defensive. She said something about difficult times and doing what was necessary." "What time was this?" "Late. I'd looked at my clock when the voices first woke me. It was just past midnight. I listened for perhaps 5 minutes, then decided to come down properly and see who it was, but as I reached the bottom of the servants' stairs and was about to enter the hall, I heard movement on the main staircase, footsteps ascending quite rapidly." "Did you see who it was?" "No. The hall was dark except for the landing light, which was burning. I saw a shadow, a figure moving up the stairs, but I couldn't distinguish any features. It rather frightened me, I confess. The talk of ghosts had made me nervous, so I turned back and returned to my room." "Did you hear anything else? The voices continuing, perhaps?" "No. Everything went quiet. I assume Mr. Ventnor and whoever he had been talking to had both gone upstairs. I certainly never imagined—" She stopped, her voice catching. "If I'd known what would happen, I would have investigated properly. Perhaps if I'd shown myself, interrupted whatever was occurring." "You cannot blame yourself for what you didn't know," Miss Marple said gently. "Tell me, did you mention any of this to your mother?" "I mentioned hearing voices, yes, but Mother said I should keep quiet about it. She said there was no point in causing difficulties for Cousin Elspeth, who had troubles enough, and after all I hadn't actually seen anything definite." "Your mother is protective of Mrs. Crane?" "They are the cousins, though not particularly close." but Mother has always been conscious of family obligations, and I think she feels rather guilty about our own prosperity while Cousin Elspeth struggles." Judith leaned forward, her young face earnest. "Miss Marple, do you think Mr. Ventnor's death was really an accident?" "What do you think, my dear?" "I don't know, but I keep remembering those voices, the argument about money, and then the next morning he was dead. It seems an odd coincidence." "In my experience," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "coincidences do occur, but when they occur at particularly convenient moments for particular people, they bear closer examination." After Judith had gone, Miss Marple sat for a time in contemplation. The picture was becoming clearer. Ventnor had arranged a private meeting with someone, almost certainly Mrs. Crane based on the diary entry, to discuss the financial discrepancies he had discovered. That meeting had taken place in the entrance hall shortly after midnight. They had argued. Then someone had ascended the main staircase rapidly, and at some point during or after this sequence of events, Ventnor had fallen to his death. Miss Marple rose and made her way to the entrance hall. It was empty at this hour, the household occupied with the departure of the Ashfords. She stood at the foot of the main staircase and looked upward, attempting to reconstruct events. Ventnor and his companion had been standing here, near where she now stood, discussing the missing funds. Judith had heard them from the servants' stairs, but had not entered the hall. Then she had heard rapid footsteps ascending the main staircase. If those footsteps had belonged to Mrs. Crane, fleeing upward in distress after the confrontation, that would leave Ventnor alone in the hall. But why would he then follow her up the dangerous staircase he supposedly never used? Unless he was attempting to continue the conversation, to press his point while she was vulnerable, or unless he was not alone after all. Miss Marple climbed the stairs slowly, her hand on the banister, thinking through possibilities. At the landing she paused. The polished section of banister was before her, the place where someone had stood repeatedly, gripping the wood, leaning over to watch the hall below. You positioned herself there and looked down. From this vantage point one could see everything, the front door, the entrance to the study and drawing room, the base of the stairs. If someone had been standing here when Ventnor arrived in the hall for his meeting with Mrs. Crane, they would have witnessed the entire conversation, and if that someone had descended silently while Ventnor and Mrs. Crane were occupied with their discussion, they could have positioned themselves behind Ventnor at the foot of the stairs, unseen in the shadows. Miss Marple examined the landing more carefully. The lamp table was positioned precisely where someone standing at the polished section of banister would need it, close enough to provide light, but not so close as to illuminate the watcher's features from below. The lamp had been carefully trimmed, maintained, ready for use. This was not a lamp left burning by accident. This was a lamp kept ready for a specific purpose. She thought of the mysterious footsteps heard on multiple nights, the ascending and descending pattern. Someone climbing to this landing, standing here to watch or listen, then descending again, creating an illusion of supernatural activity that would keep curious servants away while simultaneously establishing a pattern that would provide cover for something else. "You're very interested in that staircase, Miss Marple?" She turned to find Charles Crane standing at the entrance to the corridor. He leaned against the doorframe with a studied casualness, but his eyes were sharp. "I confess I find it intriguing," Miss Marple replied. "Such a beautiful architectural feature, yet unused. It seems rather a waste. My mother's sentimentality. She can't bear to modernize it or remove it, yet she won't allow it to be used. Typical of her approach to most things, actually. Clinging to the past while refusing to acknowledge present realities." He came onto the landing, moving with the easy confidence of someone familiar with the space. "I used to play here as a child, you know. Pirates and explorers, that sort of thing. The landing was a ship's deck and the stairs were the gangplank. I knew every inch of it." "Including the best vantage points for watching?" Charles smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Including those, I discovered quite young that one could observe a great deal from this spot without being observed in return. Very useful during tedious adult gatherings when one wanted to know what was really happening downstairs." "And have you made use of that knowledge recently?" What an interesting question, Miss Marple. Are you suggesting I've been spying on my own household? I'm suggesting that someone has been using this landing as a watching post. The evidence is quite clear if one knows what to look for. Charles moved to the polished section of banister and ran his hand along it, much as Miss Marple had done. Clever of you to notice. Yes, I've been standing here. For the past week, in fact. Ever since Ventnor arrived and started his investigation into our fancies. You were watching him? I was watching Mother. I wanted to know what she told him, what explanation she gave for the missing money, whether she would finally tell the truth or continue to dissemble. And what did you discover? Charles's expression hardened. That my mother is a consummate liar. That she's been systematically borrowing against the estate to maintain appearances, taking money meant for repairs and staff wages to pay for her precious dignity. Ventnor discovered it all, of course. He was thorough, and he wanted to know where the money went. Where did it go? Some of it went to maintaining this mausoleum, but not all. Mother has expensive taste she thinks no one notices. The new curtains in the drawing room, the recent repairs to her personal rooms, the quarterly trips to London she claims are for economy, but which somehow result in new clothes and jewellery. His voice was bitter. All while claiming we must economise, while the tenant cottages leak and the estate workers go unpaid. Miss Marple considered him carefully. You were here, on this landing, the night Mr. Ventnor died. It was not a question. Charles met her gaze steadily. Yes, I heard them arguing in the hall, Mother and Ventnor. I'd been in my room but heard voices and came to investigate. By the time I reached this landing, they were in full argument. Ventnor was demanding explanations, threatening to contact the bank if Mother couldn't account for the discrepancies. Mother was crying, pleading for more time. What happened then? Mother ran up the stairs, these stairs. She fled past me without even seeing me, too distraught to notice. I stood here watching. Ventnor stood at the bottom, looking up. He seemed to be deciding whether to follow her. Did he? Charles was silent for a long moment. I don't know. I returned to my room. I didn't want to be caught eavesdropping. Whatever happened after that, I didn't witness it. But you heard nothing? No sound of a fall? Nothing? He met her eyes. Which has troubled me considerably, Miss Marple, because as you've observed, I know this staircase intimately, and I know that a man falling down it would make considerable noise. Chapter 9. The House Learns to Listen. The departure of Mrs. Ashford and Judith left Greyfriar House feeling even more desolate. Miss Marple watched their motor car disappear down the drive, then turned back to the drawing room where Mrs. Crane sat alone, staring into the fire with unseeing eyes. They were kind to stay as long as they did, Mrs. Crane said without looking up, though I suspect Pamela was eager to escape. She never did care for country life. Miss Marple settled into a chair and took up her knitting. Difficult circumstances make everyone uncomfortable. Yes, Mrs. Crane's voice was flat, though I suspect the circumstances will become more difficult still. The coroner's inquest is tomorrow. They'll ask questions I'm not prepared to answer. The truth is generally the best answer I've found. Is it? Mrs. Crane finally looked at her, and Miss Marple saw in her face the particular exhaustion that came from sleepless nights and guilty conscience. What if the truth makes everything worse? What if it destroys what little remains? Mrs. Crane, Miss Marple said gently, I think perhaps you should tell me what happened that night. Not what you told the inspector, but what actually occurred. For a long moment, Mrs. Crane said nothing. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and somewhere in the house a door closed. Finally, she spoke. How did you know? I've observed a great deal during my stay here. The staircase that no one uses, but which shows clear signs of regular passage. The landing light that burns when it shouldn't. The financial difficulties you've been attempting to conceal. And most significantly, your nightly visits to the staircase standing exactly where you stood that night, looking down at where Mr. Ventnor fell. Mrs. Crane's hands twisted in her lap. I didn't mean for it to happen. You must believe that. Why don't you tell me what did happen, and I shall form my own conclusions." Mrs. Crane was silent for a time, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Harold Ventnor was my husband's oldest friend. When Robert died 3 years ago and I discovered the true state of our finances, I turned to Harold for help. He agreed to review the accounts to help me understand what could be salvaged. But there were complications. Robert had been living far beyond our means for years. The estate was mortgaged, there were debts everywhere, investments that had failed. Harold helped me navigate through it all. He arranged loans, consolidated debts, created a plan for gradually paying everything off. But it required strict economy. Every penny had to be accounted for." "And you found that difficult?" Mrs. Crane's voice hardened with defensive pride. "This house has been in the Crane family for 3 generations. We have a position in the county, responsibilities to maintain. I couldn't simply let everything fall to pieces. The staff depended on us. The tenants looked to us. I had to preserve some dignity, some sense of normalcy. So you began taking money that should have been used for other purposes." "Small amounts at first. Just enough to maintain appearances. I told myself it was temporary, that I would replace it when circumstances improved. But circumstances never did improve. The amounts grew larger. And Harold, with his meticulous record-keeping, eventually noticed." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. "He confronted you about the discrepancies?" "Yes, several days ago. He was very cold about it, very precise. He showed me his calculations, £1,600 unaccounted for over the past 2 years. He wanted to know where it had gone. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. He said I'd been dishonest, that I'd violated the trust he'd placed in me. He threatened to contact the bank to expose everything." "What did you do?" "I begged for time. I asked him to meet me privately after the household retired so we could discuss it without others overhearing. He agreed. We met in the entrance hall just after midnight." "And what transpired?" Mrs. Crane's voice broke. "He was so angry. Angrier than I'd ever seen him. He said I'd been living a lie, that I'd squandered money on vanities while claiming poverty. He said the house should be sold, that it was the only sensible solution. I became desperate. I told him I couldn't bear it, that I'd rather die than lose everything Robert had left me." She paused, her breath coming in short gasps. "He said that was melodramatic nonsense, that I needed to face reality. And then he said he was going to write to the bank first thing in the morning, that he couldn't in good conscience allow the deception to continue." "What did you do?" "I ran. I fled up the main staircase, too upset to think clearly. I just wanted to get away from him, from his accusations, from the truth of what I'd done. I ran to my room and locked the door. But that wasn't the end, was it?" Mrs. Crane shook her head, tears beginning to flow. "I took my sleeping draught, a double dose. I was so distraught. I must have fallen asleep almost immediately. When I woke the next morning, Rose was screaming. Harold was dead at the foot of the stairs, and her voice caught. I thought I must have caused it somehow, that my flight up the stairs had startled him, made him attempt to follow me in the dark, that if I hadn't run, if I'd stayed and reasoned with him, he would still be alive." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded Mrs. Crane with sympathetic but penetrating eyes. "Mrs. Crane, have you considered that Mr. Ventnor's death might not have been your fault at all?" "But who else?" Mrs. Crane stopped, her eyes widening. "Charles? You think Charles had something to do with it?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we must consider all possibilities. Your son admitted to me that he was on the landing that night, watching and listening to your argument with Mr. Ventnor. He saw you flee upstairs. He saw Mr. Ventnor standing at the base of the staircase deciding whether to follow. But Charles would never, he couldn't, perhaps not. But let me tell you what I believe actually happened that night." Miss Marple rose and walked to the window, organising her thoughts. When she turned back, her voice was calm and certain. Someone in this house, I believe it was Charles, had been creating an illusion of haunting for several nights prior to Mr. Ventnor's death. The mysterious footsteps, the burning landing light, the atmosphere of supernatural unease. This served two purposes. First, it kept curious servants away from the main staircase during the hours when he wished to observe the household undetected. Second, it established a pattern that would later provide cover for movement on the stairs. But why would Charles need to observe the household? Because he suspected you of financial impropriety and wanted evidence. By standing on the landing at night, he could watch the study, see when you worked on the accounts, observe your meetings with Mr. Ventnor. He learned a great deal through patient observation. Mrs. Crane's face had gone very white. He was spying on me. He was trying to understand what was happening to his inheritance. Can you blame him for that? Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. Now, on the night in question, Charles was at his usual post on the landing when you and Mr. Ventnor argued below. He witnessed the entire confrontation. He saw you flee upstairs past him, and he saw Mr. Ventnor standing at the base of the staircase. Yes, but Mr. Ventnor never climbed those stairs, Mrs. Crane. His bedroom was untouched, his bed unslept in. He never retired for the night at all. The question is, what happened to him after you left? Mrs. Crane stared at her, comprehension dawning slowly. You think someone else was there? Someone who... I think, Miss Marple said, that someone descended the staircase while you and Mr. Ventnor were arguing. Someone who had been watching from above and decided to intervene. That person reached the bottom of the stairs just as you fled upward. They were standing in the shadows when Mr. Ventnor turned to consider whether to follow you. And they pushed him? Mrs. Crane's voice was barely audible. I don't believe so. I think they engaged him in conversation, perhaps asking him to step outside to discuss the matter privately away from your hearing. Or perhaps they suggested returning to the study to review the accounts together. Mr. Ventnor, distracted and agitated from the confrontation with you, followed them, but he never reached wherever they were going. How can you possibly know this? Because, Miss Marple said, the one thing everyone agrees upon is that no one heard Mr. Ventnor fall. A body tumbling down a long wooden staircase makes considerable noise, yet the household slept undisturbed. That suggests his fall occurred later when he was already unconscious or otherwise incapacitated. She paused, letting this sink in. I believe Mr. Ventnor was rendered unconscious elsewhere, perhaps struck on the head, perhaps given something in a drink. His body was then carried to the top of the staircase and positioned as to appear as though he had fallen. The landing light was left burning to suggest he had been using the stairs despite their danger, and the illusion of haunting that had been so carefully cultivated provided an explanation for any sounds that might have been heard. Mrs. Crane's hands flew to her mouth. Dear God! Who would do such a thing? Someone who had as much to lose as you did from Mr. Ventnor's exposure of the financial irregularities. Someone who knew the house intimately, who had been using the staircase regularly and understood exactly how to stage a convincing accident. Someone who... A sound from the doorway made them both turn. Charles Crane stood there, his face unreadable. Someone, he said quietly, who loved his mother enough to protect her from ruin, even at such a terrible cost. Chapter 10. How the Staircase Was Used. The silence that followed Charles's admission was profound. Mrs. Crane sat frozen, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. Miss Marple remained by the window, her expression grave but unsurprised. Charles himself stood in the doorway, his shoulders slumped as though a great weight had finally been lifted. "Charles, no," Mrs. Crane whispered. "Tell me you didn't. You couldn't have." "I could, and I did." His voice was flat, drained of emotion. "Though not quite as Miss Marple has described it. May I come in? I find I would prefer to sit while I explain what actually happened." Miss Marple nodded. and Charles entered, closing the door behind him. He moved to the chair opposite his mother and sat heavily, like a man much older than his 30 years. "You're quite right about most of it, Miss Marple," he began. "I had been watching from the landing for several nights. I knew Ventnor was investigating the accounts, and I wanted to know what Mother had told him. I created the illusion of haunting the footsteps, the burning light, to keep the servants away and to establish a pattern that might be useful later." "You planned this in advance?" Mrs. Crane's voice was barely audible. "Not murder, no. But I knew the confrontation was coming. I knew Ventnor would eventually discover the truth, and I wanted to be prepared for whatever followed. I'm not proud of that, Mother, but I'm done with pretending." He leaned back, his eyes distant, as though seeing events replay in his mind. "That night, I was at my usual post on the landing when you and Ventnor began arguing below. I heard everything, his accusations, your pleas, his threats to contact the bank. When you fled upstairs, past me, I saw the horror on your face. You looked destroyed, utterly broken." Mrs. Crane covered her face with her hands, but Charles continued relentlessly. Ventnor stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up. "I thought he might follow you, and I couldn't bear the thought of him pursuing you in that state, pressing his advantage while you were vulnerable. So I descended, quietly, using the edge of the treads where they don't creak. I've known how to move silently on these stairs since childhood." "What did you say to him?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I suggested we discuss the matter like rational men, away from Mother's hearing. I proposed we go to the study, review the accounts together, and find a solution that didn't involve public scandal." Ventnor hesitated, but ultimately agreed. He was a reasonable man for all his rigidity. He wanted to be fair. Charles's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "We went to the study. I poured him a whiskey, a large one, which he accepted gratefully. We sat and talked. I tried to explain Mother's position, the pressures she'd been under, the impossibility of maintaining a house like this on our reduced income. I asked him to be lenient, to give us time to make things right, but he refused. He was sympathetic but firm. He said he had a professional responsibility, that he couldn't turn a blind eye to such significant irregularities. He said the kindest thing he could do was help us face reality, even if that meant selling the house. He didn't understand, or wouldn't understand, that this house is all we have left of who we were, of what Father built." Charles paused, his jaw working. "I became angry. We argued." He remained maddeningly calm, which only infuriated me more. At some point I stood and walked to the window, trying to control my temper. When I turned back, Ventnor was rising from his chair, saying he thought we'd said all there was to say, that he would retire for the night and we could speak again in the morning. "But you couldn't let him do that," Miss Marple observed. "No, because I knew that in the morning he would write to the bank. Everything would unravel. Mother would be exposed, humiliated. The house would be lost. I acted without thinking, or perhaps I was thinking too clearly. I picked up the poker from the fireplace and struck him as he turned toward the door." Mrs. Crane made a sound of anguish, but Charles continued, his voice mechanical now, as though reporting events that had happened to someone else. He collapsed immediately. There was very little blood. I'd struck him at the base of the skull. I stood there for several minutes trying to comprehend what I'd done. Then survival instinct took over. I couldn't simply leave him in the study. When he was discovered, the circumstances would raise questions, but if he were found at the foot of the stairs, it would appear to be an accident. "So you carried him to the staircase," Miss Marple said. "Yes, he was a heavy man, but adrenaline gives one unexpected strength. I carried him up to the landing I knew so well from all my watching and waiting. I positioned him at the top of the stairs, then pushed him down. The sound was terrible, but I knew Mother had taken her sleeping draught. She wouldn't hear, and the servants sleep in the attic, too far away." He looked at his hands as though they belonged to a stranger. The landing light was already burning. I'd lit it earlier, as part of my usual routine. I left it burning to suggest Ventnor had been using the stairs. Then I returned to the study, cleaned the poker thoroughly, replaced it by the fire, and removed the whiskey glass Ventnor had used, I went to my room and waited for morning. Mrs. Crane was weeping silently, her shoulders shaking. Charles watched her with an expression of profound sadness. "I did it for you, Mother. To protect you from ruin and disgrace. I told myself I was protecting the family, the house, everything Father had worked for, but Miss Marple is right to look at me with such disappointment. I was protecting myself as well. I couldn't bear to lose everything, to become nothing. So I killed a good man who was only trying to do his duty." Miss Marple moved from the window and sat down, her knitting in her lap, but her needle still. Mr. Crane, why did you confess just now? You might have remained silent. I have no proof of what I suggested, only conjecture. Charles gave a bitter smile. Because you would have found proof, wouldn't you? You're far too clever to make accusations you couldn't support. And more importantly, because I'm tired. Tired of lying, tired of watching Mother torture herself with guilt for something she didn't do. Tired of living with what I've done. He turned to Mrs. Crane. Mother, you must understand, none of this was your fault. You made mistakes with the money, yes, but that didn't warrant what I did. I made my own choice, and now I must face the consequences. Mrs. Crane reached out to him, her hand trembling. Charles, No, Mother. Don't make excuses for me. Don't diminish what I've done by trying to share the blame. He took her hand gently. You must promise me something. After this is over, after whatever punishment I receive, you'll sell this house. Let it go. It's not worth what we've sacrificed for it. I can't. You can. You must. This house has been our prison, our obsession. It's made us blind to what actually matters. Please, Mother, promise me. Mrs. Crane could only nod, tears reaming down her face. Miss Marple spoke softly. Mr. Crane, you understand that I cannot remain silent about this. A man has been murdered. Justice must be served. I know. I wouldn't ask you to protect me. Charles stood, his movements weary. Shall I go to the police, or will you contact them? I think it would be best if you went yourself, but not alone. Your mother should accompany you, and perhaps you should speak with a solicitor first. Ever practical, Miss Marple? Yes, that makes sense. He looked around the drawing room, as though seeing it for the last time. Strange how a place can mean so much and so little simultaneously. I thought I was fighting to preserve something precious, but I was only clinging to shadows. He turned back to his mother. I'm sorry, Mother, for everything, for failing you, for failing Father's memory, for being too weak to accept change, most of all, for taking a life to preserve a lie. Miss Marple remained at Greyfriar House while Charles and Mrs. Crane went to the village police station. She sat in the drawing room, her knitting moving in steady rhythm, thinking about pride and fear and the terrible things people did when they confused possessions with worth. In St. Mary Mead, she had observed how people clung to symbols of status long after the reality had crumbled. Mrs. Emmett, maintaining her dead husband's study exactly as he'd left it. Colonel Bantry refusing to modernise his estate even as it bankrupted him. And now the Cranes, sacrificing truth and morality to preserve a house that had become their identity rather than simply their home. When Mrs. Crane returned several hours later, her face was composed though her eyes were red from weeping. Charles had been taken into custody. The inspector had been contacted. The terrible machinery of justice had begun to turn. He asked me to thank you, Mrs. Crane said, sinking into a chair, for giving him the opportunity to confess rather than forcing it from him. He said it made the burden lighter somehow, choosing to acknowledge the truth. I'm glad of that, at least, Miss Marple replied. They sat in silence for a time. Finally, Mrs. Crane spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. How did you know, Miss Marple? How did you piece it together? Old houses do not frighten us, Miss Marple said gently, echoing the words from her outline. It is the knowledge we avoid that gives them power. You and Charles were both avoiding knowledge. You of the full extent of your financial mismanagement, he of his own capacity for violence. The staircase became a symbol of that avoidance, a place of secrets and shadows. She set down her knitting and looked at Mrs. Crane with compassion. The staircase was never haunted, Mrs. Crane. It was managed to frighten, to mislead, and to keep people away. And in the end, it was used not for supernatural purposes, but for the most mundane and tragic of human failings, the inability to accept loss. Mrs. Crane nodded slowly. Will you stay until after Christmas? I find I cannot bear to be alone just now. Of course, Miss Marple said, though I suspect it will be a rather quiet holiday. And so Miss Marple remained at Greyfriar House through the inquest and the arrest, through the quiet Christmas that felt more like mourning than celebration, offering what comfort she could to a woman who had lost both her son and her illusions in the span of a few terrible days. The main staircase stood empty and silent, its decorations removed, its secrets finally revealed. And Miss Marple, packing to return to St. Mary Mead in the new year, reflected that houses were only ever as haunted as the consciences